Well, hello everyone. As you can see, our neighborhood has changed a lot in the last couple of years. So I thought this might be a good time to tell a little story, a history of this community, especially for the sake of my grandchildren. But the new neighbors are interested, and the rest of you can listen in if you care to. I moved here with my wife Rhoda when we were first married in 1978. It was actually my father who suggested that maybe Grandpa Ebersole might support my idea of building a house on some ground that he had by his house that he had built back in 1960. Grandpa seemed happy with this idea, so that's what we did. And Rhoda and I have lived here ever since. But I would like to start this story 2 generations earlier. Just 2 miles west on the Marietta Pike from the Centerville Road is a little town called Silver Springs. My grandfather, Chris Ebersole, raised his family in this house along the Marietta Pike. He operated a building business out of an office in the front of the house, and the shop was in the back. This was back in the 1930s when he just got started in his business. There were 2 phones in the neighborhood, one in the grocery store where the post office was located, and the other in Grandpa's office. So my mother remembers all the neighbors coming to chat with Grandma, to use the phone or just to talk. Grandpa was not a builder who developed land to build houses. If a person had a plot of ground, they would call my grandpa and he would build the house or barn. Not with contracts, just time material, as he would call it. So now let's jump back to our neighborhood. John and Bertha Harnish farmed this ground bordered by the Stony Battery Road and the Marietta Pike for many years. And in 1958, John decided to sell the plot of ground that he had on the west side of the Stony Battery Road, which since has become Sandstone Drive. Because Grandpa was a builder, not a developer, John was surprised when Grandpa showed up at his auction. When John saw that my grandpa was the second to last bidder on that ground, he came to Grandpa afterwards and asked him if he would be interested in his land north of the Marietta Pike. Grandpa responded that, well, we should get together and talk. Grandpa and John Harnish were longtime friends as they sat beside each other every Sunday morning at Chestnut Hill Mennonite Church. So the next week, Grandpa stopped in to see John. Grandpa suggested both of them should write down on a piece of paper a number that they had in mind for the value of this plot of ground to see how close they were. And when they turned their papers over, both had written down $15,000. They smiled and said, well, I guess we have a deal. So in 1960, Grandpa divided the 7 acres of land into 5 building lots. He sold the house to his daughter, who with her husband raised their family there. The barn became his shop. Then he built a stone house for Grandma and himself with his office. I should say that the house on this property is probably one of the oldest houses in the neighborhood. As early as 1821, it shows up on the maps as White Horse Tavern. However, it became known as Oyster Point by the locals because they served oysters. No one is sure when the tavern closed, but it does show up in the 1864 Bridgeon Atlas of Lancaster County, so it may have been operating as a tavern for more than 40 years before it became a farmhouse. When Dr. David Fuchs bought this house from my Uncle Lloyd and Aunt Ethel, he opened up the plaster walls to expose the log beams that had been there since early 1800s or whenever it was built. He also named his practice Oyster Point Family Health Center to give new life to the name the old-timers called this intersection. Of course, the building no longer looks like a simple house, as it had become, with many additions, a large medical center. When I was a child visiting Grandma at this house on Marietta Pike, we could walk to the Hollinger Food Market just next door. I remember a single gas pump just outside the store. Later it was sold and it became a shop for a furniture refinisher. In those days, Centerville Road was just a 2-lane country road surrounded on all sides by farmland. In 1960, John and Bertha Harnisch also gave land to the Hempfield United Methodist Church. It was an Evangelical United Brethren church at the time. There were 2 Evangelical United Brethren churches in the neighborhood. One was just across the street from Grandpa's house in Silver Springs, and the other one was here on Centerville Road. They came together to build the new church here on the corner of John Harnisch's farm. The Evangelical United Brethren denomination later became the United Methodist Church in 1968. John and Bertha's only living daughter, Rhoda, lived her whole life here on the farm. When she died, the farm was sold to the city of Lancaster in the year 2020. They had used the farm for their water treatment reservoir for the water coming from the Susquehanna River for years, and they wanted to expand that facility. So all of the farm buildings were taken away, and the farm remains available for farming. Back to the other side of Marietta Avenue, I came into the picture in 1976, and Grandpa offered to help me build a house on the vacant lot between his own house and barn. Grandpa had moved away 6 years before because the steps in the stone house became a bit difficult for Grandma. At that time, Elizabeth and Aaron Herr still farmed in the 27-acre farm behind this property. As we were building our house, I remember Aaron was not so strong at the time, and so he drove the old John Deere B tractor pulling a potato hoe, and his wife Elizabeth would push and guide the potato hoe into the ground, working out the potato harvest. It was just amazing to me how strong Elizabeth was, as they were living well into their 80s at that point. Aaron died around 1989, but Elizabeth was still gardening well into her 90s and lived to be 101 years old. She was born here at this house, this home, and she wanted to live out her days here. They had no children, so the farm was sold at auction in the year 2013 to a local farmer. The farm was a disappointment to the farmer because it wasn't large enough for significant crops. His vegetables were eaten by the deer, and there was a lot of wetland which made some farming difficult. So eventually he sold it to a developer, which brings us to this point in our history. I have to admit, it was sad to see the old timber barns dismantled, even though one could say they were in disrepair. Then all these massive machines rolled in here, chewing up the trees. Giant earth-moving machines then began carving up the ground. It took more than a year to sculpture the ground, creating mounds of ground for open basements for some houses, and at the same time carving out the hillsides for level building lots for others. Track hoes worked constantly, digging out a large retention basin for all the runoff water, and in doing so created this large lake where the farm buildings once stood. After the storm sewers and the sewers, the water lines were in place, they started to work on the streets. Concrete trucks fed the curb machine, and workers followed up by touching up the finish work. Then all the other utilities were laid. The electric wires, cable for internet, gas lines were run. It all took a long time. It was a dusty year. Eventually, the first house was started. The foundations were dug, footers were poured, forms were set up, and concrete walls were poured. Finally, the framers made it all happen. It did not take but 2 weeks for the building to take shape. When they were finished, the second foundation was getting ready for them to start all over again. We were eager to meet our first neighbors when they would begin to move in. After about 4 months from the time that the foundation was dug, the new neighbors would begin to move in. It has been an exciting journey to meet our new neighbors. I grew up on a farm. We met our neighbors when we went to church on Sunday. However, Rhoda grew up in a neighborhood and she was accustomed to meeting neighbors regularly. The quiet road has become a daily exercise walk for us, and along the way we would usually meet 1 or 2 of our new neighbors. So it's been a lot of fun to learn to know our new neighbors, and I hope that they enjoy this neighborhood as much as Rhoda and I have.